Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's history story. This week is a little different as I am recording this outside at St Peter's Churchyard at the location of the grave of Dr James Milne. This may be a little shorter than usual, but you can never tell because when I'm filming outside I do sometimes remember extra things to say when I see them. I first saw this headstone or monument, memorial, whichever you prefer, several years ago, and I often wondered who Dr Milne was. I assumed he must have been well liked to have such an impressive headstone, but of course it's been here now since 1875, so it's no longer the same as it was when it was first built. As you can see, the top part has fallen off, which is over there, and there's also more of that round the back, which I will show you a little later. Sadly, there isn't a lot to be found about Dr Milne. After doing a walk around the churchyard last year, a friend did some research and found a few details, and this made me dig a little deeper. But other than the details of the service to unveil this headstone, there's not much to be found about him. So what I do know is this. James Milne was born in Scotland in around 1826. He was one of 8 children born to William and Margaret Milne. In Scotland, in the area where he was born, I found a lot of Dr Milnes, so they could well be relatives of his, and this may be why James became a doctor. Sadly, I have no details of his father's job, so I do not know if he was a doctor as well. There are no details of when or why Dr Milne and his family came to the northeast and the Wallsend area. In 1871, James was living in Wallsend in a property on the High Street, and prior to that, in 1861, he'd been living on Shields Road with his mother and brother Charles. In both 1861 and 1871, he is listed as a surgeon. Now, although there's little information about his life, it is said that he did a lot for the area. Not just Wallsend, but Willington Quay and Walker as well. I lost my train of thought there. And it is possible that he even gave his own money at times to help those in need. He seems to have been a very popular man. James died on June the 3rd, 1874, which is what this little bit of the monument actually says, which we'll come back to a little later. He was 49 years old when he died. There are no details regarding the cause of death, and it was said that at the time he was living in Rose Hill and he was buried in St Peter's Churchyard without a headstone. Obviously, the people of Wallsend felt that this was something that they needed to put right, and a lower committee was set up to raise the funds. The only names I can find in connection with it is a Mr E. Hutchinson, a Mr J. Tin, and a Mr W. Wetherall, so I'm unsure who else was involved. It would take almost a year for the money to be raised and then the work to be completed. So just over a year after the death of James Milne, on Saturday, June the 5th, 1875, the headstone that you can see was unveiled in a very, very impressive ceremony. People had met to form a procession at the Carville end of Wallsend, and it was said that over 3,000 people walked to St Peter's Churchyard, including 3 different bands, and the bands were the Walker Rifle Volunteer Band, the Wallsend Boilermakers Band, and the Victoria Band of Willington Quay. I must admit to not having heard of any of those bands before, and I would love to know if anyone knows anything about them. It is said that on arriving at the churchyard they formed a circle around the headstone. Now, I don't know quite how so many people manage this, as you can see it is quite close to the church itself, although there is a lot more space on that side, so it must have been a very large circle. The Reverend Jenkins of St Peter's performed the service, and although he had, sorry, that sounds like a tractor or something going past, St Peter's is quite close to the road, so there's not a lot you can do sometimes about extra sound effects. So anyway, the Reverend Jenkins of St Peter's performed the service, and though he had not known him long, he described him as 1 in 1,000, and a man who had a large-hearted sympathy for his fellow man. Mr. Hutchinson also gave a speech, and it was he who suggested that James had practised in Wallsend, Willington Quay and Walker for around 28 years and was well respected and very much missed. The volunteer band played the Dead March and the Willington band played a Spanish chant. After this, the ceremony was said to have ended. I don't know what a Spanish chant is, and I haven't actually had time to look that up, so if anybody knows what that is, they can maybe let me know. The headstone was described as being of Gothic design with moulded bases and clustered columns, among other things. It was also described as having a spire and cross. This is the part that I mentioned earlier that I'll show you that's round the back, which has now fallen from the top. And the bust that you can see at the front was described as being a life-size bust of the deceased gentleman. Now, if I get a little closer to it, you can see that the eyes and the nose and a little bit of the mouth has actually worn away, but you can still see what Dr. James Milne might have looked like. And if he truly did look like this, and he looks like someone who you would not have had any trouble trusting, and you would have definitely have looked to him for help and advice. The whole monument was said to be 17 feet high and was made from Prudham stone. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. And there was a quarry in Hexham known as Prudham Quarry, so perhaps this is where the stone came from. The sculptor was a Mr. George Byrne. You can just make that out on the bottom of the plinth there. And he was from Newcastle, and the cost was said to have been between £50 and £60. And now we've got a siren. Having a lot of great side effects in my story today, so at least you're getting real life as it happens. The cost of the headstone was said to be between £50 and £60, which today would be around £8,500. The inscriptions are now quite difficult to read, but they are as follows, and this one on the front, which I'm just zooming in on there. This memorial was erected by a few friends of the late Dr. James Milne of Wallsend, who died June the 3rd, 1874, aged 49 years. I must add that a newspaper report said June the 4th, but it was definitely June the 3rd. The other inscriptions are, and I'll just go around to this side, to this one. So this inscription says, I was hungry and ye fed me, naked and ye gave me clothes. In my sufferings ye did tend me, may thy soul find sweet repose. And at the bottom it says, go and do thou likewise. And just down here you can see, I was going to say a carving, it's an engraving of some kind, same thing. And I would assume that this was something to do with the medical service because of it, Dr. Milne being a doctor. That makes a lot of sense, Julie. But, you know. And on this side of the headstone, we have the other inscription, which says, we in remembrance of thy kindness, strongly on our hearts impress it. Raise this tribute to thy memory, where in peace thy ashes rest, and the memory of the just is blessed. Now, just before I go round the back, I will just show you that next to the monument for Dr. James Milne is this headstone here, and this is for his brother. This has sadly fallen over, so it's almost impossible to read, but if I just get a little bit closer to the engraving on the front, it says Charles Wellesley Milne, who departed this life, and it's December sometime in 1874, but I can't read that because I'll just point at it. You can see it's all covered in moss. And then it says age 42 years. Now, I don't know if Charles's wife is buried here too or not, as I can't see her mentioned. And I also don't have any indication of where their mother was buried. So I'm just going to go around to the back of the headstone, and before I do that, there is another engraving on that side, which again I think is probably something to do with the medical profession. So around the back, the part that I mentioned earlier, which basically, as I said, was 17 feet high, so you can see the height of the stone if I just step back at the moment. On top of that would have been this part here, then this part would have gone on top of that, and then this part here is the spire, which I assume would have stood right on the top of that. And then there was a cross right on the very top, but I don't know what's happened to the cross. The cross doesn't appear to be here. There are columns that went up either corner, which you can just see a little bit of one of them there, and what remains of those appears to be down there between the top block and the actual headstone itself, but I cannot see any indication of a cross. So unfortunately, like I say, 1875 is a long time, so it has just deteriorated with age. And as I'm standing back here, I'm not standing sideways, the whole monument is leaning towards the church. So that really is about all there is to say this week. I do hope that you've still found this interesting, even with all the little added extras like the sirens and my waffle. But you know you get waffle when I do live recordings outside. And who knows, maybe one day I will find out a little bit more about Dr. Milne's life. So thank you all for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.